because I love a stage. I love any opportunity to talk and have a captive audience. So I'm just going to take this opportunity and tell you an anecdote about somebody named Martha Wilson. So Martha Wilson, 100% real one, unlike anybody else. In the 1950s, Martha Wilson was a single mother, neuroscientist, working on the effect of brain lesions on the visual cortices of bush babies. So just picture single mother, 1950s Connecticut basement of a monkey lab. And a fun fact about her is that she met her second and last husband at this monkey lab. And he wooed her by coming up to her and saying that he'd cleaned her monkey cages and also by having cleaned her monkey cages, which was amazing follow through. They went on a date. They had dinner at this family restaurant, and they decided that very night to get married. So where in the world am I going with this? Just stay with me, bear with me. And they were together until he died, 60 or 70 years later. And Martha Wilson made a number of very important discoveries about visual cortices on bush babies over the course of her career. She was political. She was active in her local friend's meeting house. She was, after she retired, she was a prison docent, and she taught incarcerated people grammar and art history and history. She was like 5 feet, 2 inches tall. She was like 98 pounds soaking wet, as they say. She had 4 children, each of them wildly successful. She had 11 grandchildren, sort of wildly successful. And she died on her own terms at 92, about 2 years ago. I did not get to say goodbye. So my grandmother, Martha Wilson, was scared of absolutely no one. She was not impressed by anyone, except for one person in this world, Cousin Jane. And when I first became interested in design, or maybe, as a teen or as an undergraduate, or maybe before that, my grandmother told me about her cousin Jane, and she said, you should really meet her. She was very important in this world, but I was a teen, or I was an undergraduate, and I was super self-involved. And so I wasn't really that interested in cousin Jane. But I did meet her once in a hotel room in Boston, and she was pretty old by then, and so was Martha. And they sat together in this very small hotel room, and I watched Martha, who I had never seen afraid of a single person in her life, just supplicate to cousin Jane. And I could tell that Martha wanted me to perform and do a good job, which I'm very interested in, the art of performance and doing a good job. And so I did my best, and I told cousin Jane about my work, my career. I was a young design writer in the early 2000s in New York, and I was impressing her. I was like, I get paid to think about architecture and architects and industrial designers and design, and I'm in this world of magazines, and maybe you know about it, but probably not because you're random. And she said, oh, how fascinating. And I didn't ask her a single question about her own life. So I did not realize, as you may by now have realized, that cousin Jane was Jane Thompson, storied design legend, founder of design research, and also, I would come to learn, at one point, the editor of ID magazine and Ralph Caplan's colleague. So I tell you this anecdote, not because I want to go on a power trip and impress you with the fact that I know cousin Jane, or she's my third cousin 14 times removed, or however that works out, but I tell you this anecdote about a hotel room and bush babies and my grandmother because I have found that anecdotes are a way into something, that they are a way to begin to connect one fact to another fact, that anecdotes can offer a method of beginning to produce a string of what may eventually, in your hands or someone else's, become meaning. And I'm very, very interested in meaning. I'm interested in the various avenues of approach available to us to absorb, produce, and consider meaning. And I'm interested this afternoon in thinking through together the purpose and pleasure of the personal in the course of finding meaning. And I want to think about that because for the last 20 years, which is how long I've been at this game, which is kind of how I think of my career, despite my very best efforts, and I have made efforts, I have not been able to separate the personal from the professional. And lately, 20 years in, I've started to think that I don't need to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and a little bit about my work and sort of in and around the ideas that interest me and a little bit about Ralph. So in an interview with the design historian Alice Twemlow, Ralph talked about the value of journalism, which I should say is somehow always up for debate and always both losing and winning. He told a story, an anecdote, if you will, about writing a piece about the designer Raymond Loewy's firm and highlighting Loewy's managing partner, William Snaith, who handled marketing. So I'm going to read the next part directly from the interview. Raymond Loewy's public relations expert, Betty Reese, had been the go-between for this profile. So this is, I'm now being Ralph. When it was published, she came to me and said, I want to invite you to the Lowy Christmas party. Now, this was a party strictly for Lowy people only, no clients, nor press or anything. At the party, Lowy announced that after all these years of refusing to share billing with anybody or anything, that they had decided to change the name of the organization from Lowy to Lowy Snaith. Because after that article, Snaith was able to say to Lowy, now everybody knows how the business works and what I do. I realized that the reason I'd been invited was to see what we had done. It made me think that what I write and publish has a consequence. End quote. So I really like this moment. And it's an example of one person, Ralph, having one particular orientation, one observation, which becomes apparent, which then becomes public, and which changes the trajectory of another person's life, of multiple people's lives. And it kind of makes me think that we're all just out here having a particular orientation, which becomes apparent, and changes the trajectory of another person's life. Again, from Ralph. It made me think that what I write and publish has a consequence. The author Maggie Nelson, who wrote, among other projects, The Argonauts, a mix of memoir and theory, said once in an interview that she wrote about herself because she was interested in herself. So often I think we are told as scholars, and particularly as journalists, and particularly as design journalists, that we need to be interested in things only outside of ourselves. And I agree, we should be interested in ideas outside of ourselves, in politics outside of ourselves, in other people outside of ourselves. And at the same time, I find that there is much to be gained by accepting that every piece of interest, or at least most pieces of interest in something outside of ourselves, is most often illuminated by something from within. So 10 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I came across the love letters of Aline Louchheim and Eero Saarinen. And I've never been much of a fan of Saarinen's, I will say, or of most architects, which is an occupational hazard. But I'm a fan of love letters. And I'm a really big fan of people being very extra, which Aline certainly was. The letters are astonishing. I encourage you to, if nothing else, read the letters themselves. She is so into Eero and so thirsty, and it's so fantastic. She's just like, I will be your wife. I will do all this stuff for you. Leave your current wife. She is not as good for you as I am. She even wrote into the New York Times, like, his wife is not that great. So it's incredible. And so I spent the next 10 years thinking about their life and their love and their work. And of course, I dressed it up in theory and history, and I made an argument for seeing and appreciating the role that Aline played in Eero's career, and by extension, seeing and appreciating the role that publicists have played in the careers of architects since the 1950s, which is maybe why Molly's Beach cohort were a little bit quaking in their boots, as they should be. And I made an argument for narrative being a constitutive element of design production, not simply a post-fact addition, which I think many designers argue that it is. Many designers are like, I designed this, the design should speak for itself, and narrative is just sort of like an extra frivolous thing, but I really, really massively disagree with that. And I made an argument for what, the students here maybe have been studying for the last few years, and for what Caplan did, which is to recognize the role of language and of narrative in design. And those arguments definitely drove my mind, and they drove the project, but they weren't always the most central driver for me. For, if you've ever written a thesis, the long nights fixing the index and rewriting the literature review and rereading the draft for the 647th time, and. So sometimes hearing that I was still working on this in seeming perpetuity, someone would ask me how a person could be interested in one topic or in one couple for 10 years. And so I would ask you now the same thing. How are you interested in design or visual culture? What is the thread of that interest? What anecdote does it tie itself to? I would imagine those of you that are students, that your professors or the people you look up to, which may be an overlapping category but may not be, I honor your path. Those whose careers you want to emulate may seem as though they have a few driving interests, but it has been my experience and observation that most people have one. My driving interest in all of my work, which has spanned essays and blogs and probably ill-advised podcasts and memoirs and works of criticism, and now my most recent book of history, is in figuring out how people begin to produce and occupy the liminal space between who they think they are and who they articulate themselves to be. So this keynote, this project, is part of that drive for me. There's who I believe I am, which is a person sort of floating around and probably an imposter and someone for whom things have happened because of rare and non-replicable accidents of fate and happenstance. And then there's the person that I want you to think I am, rigorous and really thoughtful and methodologically driven, not an imposter at all. And of course, the truth is that I am both, and I'm the latter because of how much I am the former. There's this kind of alternate fantasy world that I sometimes think about, which is this make-believe world that I thought was waiting for me until I finally realized it wasn't. And it's this world in which we treat ideas as isolated. We treat ideas as though they exist in silos, that we spend years of our lives thinking about something because it's like abstractly important and we just know it's important. And I've never met anyone who actually works or thinks like that. If any of you do, please see me afterwards. I would really like to know how that works. So the plural of anecdote is not data. But great news, I'm not here as a scientist, I'm here as an artist, and as someone who is inspired very deeply by what I learned about Ralph Caplan. I learned about his irreverence and his seriousness, and as I was starting to develop this talk, Molly sent me an archive of some of his work. There was 10 Ways of Looking at a Building, which was a collaboration with Seymour Quast, Notes on Attention, a project for Herman Miller, in which he outlines the difficulties of visual pollution, which really seems incredibly prescient. Caplan was very clearly a visual and intellectual omnivore, someone who took great delight in the world both as it was and as he saw it, and I would like to take a page from his book. So, in thinking through this, which we're doing together right now, I want to propose that there is both pleasure and purpose to the personal. The purpose, I think, is somewhat easy to define. The personal is a way in, the personal is political, the personal finds us, and we find the personal. But what about pleasure? Because pleasure is something that Caplan really seemed to find. I feel like there's been kind of a vibe shift recently, and it's one that makes me feel sometimes like I am 12,000 years old. And the shift is that pleasure or joy, as my friend and colleague Amal Andreos talks about frequently, seems to have become really loaded in some way that doesn't quite track for me. So it's either necessary or it's frivolous. It's either all we're fighting for or to be avoided in service of the cause. And in every seminar that I teach, I assign a piece by Adrienne Marie Brown called The Inches, which was published in Harvard Design Magazine. But what I want to do is assign her book, Pleasure Activism, which I read during a time where my life was almost completely devoid of pleasure, so empty of joy that all I could do was shop and shop and shop at the Walnut Creek Nordstrom, putting sweater after sweater on my credit card. I also just put this sweater on my credit card, so not everything has changed. Trying in vain to feel something, anything. I loved pleasure activism because it seemed to understand the context in which I was living, and context, of course, is everything. And I also loved it because it made me feel good. So what then is the pleasure of the personal? For me, I like to know everything about everyone. I want to ask question after question. I want to know everything. I don't believe in the concept of TMI, which is why I named this talk after the idea. And if someone wants to tell me something, I want to hear it. I never am like, oh, I wish I hadn't heard that. I'm like, tell me more. I want to know more. I want to hear about your childhood. I want to hear about your sex life, the bad and good dates you've been on. I want to hear about your mom and how she talks to you and how she used to talk to you and how that makes you feel about your own daughter or your own son. And part of that desire is that I want resonance. I want to feel less alone in the world. I want to feel less caught up in an object or on the pursuit of vainglory. And I think of Roland Barthes' book, A Lover's Discourse, which is mostly about waiting and longing. I remember a seminar that I took about A Lover's Discourse in which we talked about resonance, which is far beyond relating. Resonance is something more than that. It's when two notes hit at the same time and create a third effect. And it's something that I felt and that I want to feel with Ralph Caplan's life. It seems to me like he had a lot of fun. And like he loved what he did and cared a lot about design, from his first accidental job, as he describes it, as a packaging critic for ID Magazine, to essayist, to critic, to more. Please read his book, Cracking the Whip. His life makes me think about the pleasure of loving what we do and caring a lot about design. Because I think that beyond the personal, that is one thing that ties us together, that spans time and particular avenue and process. I care about design and architecture because it affects all of us, which maybe sounds simplistic or trite. But how often do we really remember that? I care about architecture because my dad used to live in this condo, and the front door opened in such a way that it would directly block an access point to the kitchen, which is sort of L-shaped. So if you came home with grocery bags and you opened the door, you couldn't go into the kitchen. You had to go all the way around. And every time we did that, we would say, oh, architecture. My dad doesn't live in that condo anymore, but I spent my first significant time with him there when I was 18 and home from college for the summer. And that condo and that moment is how we got to know each other and got to bond after years and years of absence. And when I think about that door, if it had been differently designed, we would have had less to bond about. I care about architecture on a sort of larger scale too. Like, I always want to know where the money comes from. and how much eminent domain was used. I care about funding and donors and tax write-offs. I'm very interested in these private museums like Glenstone, super building, very weird funding structure. And I care about greenwashing and the climate and the environment. I care about how someone feels when they walk into a space for the first or the last time. I care about where we're born and where we die. I think hospitals should have really good design. I loved the 2 nights that I spent on the antepartum ward at New York Presbyterian at 165th and Broadway. The night before the day I gave birth on the labor and delivery ward, I brought tea lights with me, which was a suggestion given to me by my friend Matt, who got it from his friend, who probably got it from his friend. And it was either the immediate epidural or the tea lights, but I had a really, really super time meeting my daughter. I met Matt as an undergraduate architecture major. We were friends and we shared a carrel, and it became very quickly apparent that Matt was an extraordinary designer, and I was one of the worst designers the school had ever seen. Truly. I was really jealous of Matt. I was really envious. He got all the attention, and I dressed that envy up in different ways, as indifference or callousness. And after he aligned himself with a certain theorist who will remain nameless, but whose name rhymes with Schmeisenman, I refused to talk to Matt. When I tell this story, it's for like 3 years, but it was probably like 3 hours. And I think all of us have someone like that, someone that we admire, but of whom we're envious, or whose life we think we want. I'm envious of Ralph Caplan's life. I'm jealous of his clarity, of the optimism and confidence that comes through in the archive and in his writing, in the accounts of people who met him. And I wish I could be like that. And maybe by wishing I could be like that, I can a little bit start to become like that. When I was starting my career, there were a few gatekeepers, which is something that I was very interested in studying historically, and lots of publications. And now there are still lots of publications, particularly some exciting new ones like NYRA, New York Review of Architecture. And I think that there are fewer gatekeepers, or at least all the gatekeepers are also editors and writers. And you may have heard that there are no jobs in design criticism, or maybe you haven't heard that, but if you do hear that, I heard the same thing 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, I was graduating from college with this degree in architecture. I couldn't draw, and I called a very well-known architecture writer, and I said, I'm like young and hungry, and I want to be an architecture writer. And he said, whatever you do on this earth, do not pursue a career in architecture writing. Alistair, I'm sorry. There are always no jobs. Everything is always falling apart. And that's why I love being a historian. In the 1950s, Aline Louchheim, soon to be Saarinen, who was a New York Times art critic turned publicist for Eero, and therefore, as I argue, the first architectural publicist, was working out how to manage his career in collaboration with various magazine editors. So there's these great letters that she sends back and forth to these editors, and she kind of pretends to be like really out of it, and she's really carefully managing who gets what project, and she's like, I threw the photos away, or like they're in the I don't know where they are. I'd shoot up my pencil. I don't know anything. And it's this incredible performance of somebody pretending that they don't know how to do what they're doing incredibly well. But she writes a lot to Douglas Haskell, who is the iconoclastic editor at Forum. And he was interested in doing exclusives, which was then a new thing. So they're going back and forth about exclusives, and then they start complaining that there's no good architectural criticism, that all the good criticism is gone. The heady glory days of architectural criticism have left us. So to contextualize this is a moment where there are 3 dedicated magazines: Record, Progressive Architecture, and Forum. And Ada Louise Huxtable existed, like she was writing, right? So that made me think. It seems to be a condition of wherever we are to complain that we are at the very precipice of the death of design criticism. And I found it helpful to read these letters because they reminded me we are always at an eternal beginning and an eternal ending, and everything always feels like the collapse of civilization, like the brink. The day after the 2016 election, I went to dinner with this very rich person in San Francisco. It was at this private restaurant that's inside the San Francisco Symphony building, and you have to be a patron above some like absurd Glenstone level to even get access to the restaurant. And I had agnolotti with peas and lemon, and it cost $48. And I had this shoulder bursitis, which my father also deals with. And at one point, my shoulder was in so much pain that I excused myself, and I went to the bathroom, and I lay on the floor, and I tried to stretch my shoulder out. And this was during a period of like many years of very mysterious physical ailments, all of which resolved completely the minute I changed my life and came back to New York. So there's this great poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, The Archaic Torso of Apollo. You must change your life. I guess I had the archaic shoulder of Eva. The shoulder bursitis was in many ways the least of my worries, but it was still a drag. But the bathroom was it was so fancy that it had a floor that I was totally comfortable lying down on. So I'm trying to give you context here, right? So I'm lying on the floor with my shoulder bursitis. And the room had really high ceilings, and it was very hushed, and there were these like really impressive looking pieces of art on the walls. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, Rome is burning. This is the end. And all I could think about was my undocumented students and my reproductive future. And here I was in this like tiny private restaurant, accessible only through extreme wealth, which I did not have, but I was in very proximate adjacency to, and it was the end of everything. There's this wonderful chapter by the philosopher Jonathan Lear in his book Radical Hope, and the chapter is about Plenty-Coup, the last leader of the Crow. Lear describes one of Plenty-Coup's last talks. When the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, Lear says, Plenty-Coup said, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. After this, nothing happened. I think about that line a lot and about that chapter, about the end of our understanding of a moment in time, about what it means for nothing to happen. And I think about breaks and ruptures, moments after which nothing happened. I have had many such breaks in my life, periods after which it feels like nothing happened, and I imagine that you have too. Sometimes these moments are cosmic, sometimes national, sometimes political, sometimes ecological. They are always personal. I am sad that Ralph Caplan isn't here anymore. That feels like an end to me, a break. I think I would have liked to meet him, would have gotten along with him. I'm glad to be able to be here so that I can try and fit myself into this little bit of, so I can fit myself a little bit into his lineage of design writers who were also openly human and improvisational, who were interested in doing things that mattered and making observations that maybe changed something here and there. But anyway, here we are. I have found it pleasurable just now to talk with you, mostly because it has given me a chance to try and put some sort of narrative cohesion around a series of ideas and questions that haunt me and plague me. I hope that we've been able to think a little bit together about the purpose and the pleasure of the personal, and I think that's a lot of what we do as design critics and as designers. Our jobs as critics is often to try and come in and layer some narrative continuity onto what we see. We look at a chair and at a table designed 5 years apart, and we say, oh, I see the designer's central concern is the relationship between modernity and postmodernities, or it's about trees. Once we've interviewed the artist, once we've written it down, they do not speak anymore. It's a strange phenomenon to be written about, and designers put their careers and their projects into our hands, so is it up to us to get it right? To say what they wish we would have said, or is it up to us to add our own layer of interpretation, of meaning, even if it's not what they saw? I think it's the latter. As design critics, I think we have a tremendous responsibility, which is to think as hard as we can about what we're looking at, to acknowledge that the work is probably personal in some way, to acknowledge that our reaction is personal in some way, and to try and take pleasure in what we're doing, the way that Ralph did. And if you've known me for a long time, it's a responsibility that I did not always take seriously, which is maybe why I try and take it so seriously now. I think I used to write mostly about things that I didn't like because it was easier to make a joke about something than try and appreciate it. But now I write only about things that I do like ideas and Rilke and Ralph. Maybe it's because my life changed, and maybe it's because I keep wanting my life to change. I don't really know. It's personal. Thank you.